Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do something very exciting. If you know me, you know that every year I am just waiting for end of year wrap-ups, like the 10 best book lists. The New York Times usually does a list of the 100 notable books of the year. I'm sure that will be coming probably next week. We'll see. This morning, the Washington Post blessed us with a sort of double dose of those things. So end of year wrap-up season is officially upon us. I know like Publishers Weekly has already done a list, but this to me is one of the big ones. So today I'm going to be looking at the Washington Post's 10 best books of 2024. And then next week I'll do a reaction to their notable list. So they're kind of playing off of the New York Times 100 notable list, but they're shortening the number, so I guess you can still say it's something a little bit different. We'll play with that and look at it next week. This is the big one. We're going to talk about the best books of the year. Now, before I begin, I have two little things I want to mention. The first is that people tend to react to these videos and say, like, well, how can you be reviewing books if you haven't read them? So I've only read one of the books that is on this top 10. And I'm not intending to review these. One of the reasons I like to look at long lists, best of lists, anything like that is to get an idea of what I might want to read. Maybe there's a book on there that I haven't really heard of or that I've seen the cover of but don't really know too much about. Or maybe there's a book I've been resisting reading, but the fact that it ends up on one of these lists makes me reconsider. That's why I like these. So I'm not trying to review books. I'm talking about interest in reading them. And my interest in reading them is going to be different from your interest in reading them. There's a distinct lack of genre books, as usual, on this list. So if you'd like to comment on what genre books or books that you have liked that were released this year, let me know in the comment section down below. But I'm not reviewing books. I'm talking about my interest in reading them, and that's about it. I feel like I have to mention that in every time I do a video like this, because every time I don't, I almost immediately start getting comments from people who are like, it feels very irresponsible to be reviewing books without having read them. These are not reviews. I can talk with authority about the one book on here that I have read. Everything else, I'm strictly talking about my own interest in reading the book and whether or not I will. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about some books that you don't see on this list. And we'll get to that. The other note is just general frustration with some large institution media this year, such as the Washington Post. I have been pretty upset, annoyed, and angry at the fact that the Washington Post was going to endorse Kamala Harris for president, and Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, essentially stepped in and would not allow them to do that endorsement. If you know me, you know that I don't support Amazon as little as possible. The only times I bend the rule a little bit is to stream a movie that is only available on Amazon's platform. But otherwise, I totally stay away from them and don't like to support them. So supporting the Washington Post by doing this feels a little weird, particularly this year, in light of all of these things. I'm still going to do it. And I'm in the same place with the New York Times. We'll talk about this when the New York Times list comes up, where I think a lot of the coverage around the election that these big established media companies, trusted media companies like the Washington Post and the New York Times have done this year has been very irresponsible. And not just about the election. The New York Times has done terrible coverage of transgender people and spread a lot of misinformation that leads to hateful rhetoric about transgender people. And I'm very upset about that. But the New York Times Book Review has a fairly new book editor, Gilbert Cruz. I like what he's been doing. I like the book review. So I'm in this weird place right now where I'm keeping my New York Times subscription almost specifically for the book review, but I don't know how long that's going to last, because when the volume of other reporting and work that they have done has not been great, and I sort of actively object to, it's difficult. And I think part of, we could go into a whole rabbit hole about why I'm mad at the Washington Post and the New York Times and the reporting that they have done around Donald Trump and this last election, and why I think it was irresponsible and why it kind of led to the situation that we are in right now. We're not going to do that. I'm just going to do a caveat right now and say that even though I am mad because I am a book person, I am going to cover these for now. Maybe if these things continue, I will revisit next year and reconsider, and maybe I won't do it. But I know a lot of other people enjoy these videos as well. These are consistently some of the most popular videos on my channel. So I know, because I'm always interested in what makes these lists and I love having conversations about them. It's something I want to do despite that sort of distaste and displeasure that I have with the institutions right now. And because I know other people are interested in them as well. We're going to do it this year. Maybe things will be different next year. Things will be less complicated. I won't have to feel like a bit of a sellout in doing these lists. But oh well. Let's just start talking about the list. So the Washington Post's 10 best books of the year, in the way of these top 10 lists, is split 5 fiction, 5 nonfiction. And some of the choices are a little bit surprising. Let's dive right in. The first book that they include, they start with fiction, is Colored Television by Danzy Senna. This is a book that I have heard of. I have access to the audio, and I have had access to the audio since this book was released, but I have not read it. I have been interested in reading it. I remember seeing good reviews of it when it came out, but I admit, in the time since it was released, publicity has sort of died down a little bit, and I had kind of forgotten about this book until the National Book Award ceremony. And we'll get to that in a second. And that's one of the other reason I love these end-of-year book lists, because not only do they sometimes introduce me to books I hadn't heard of, not only do they sometimes make me reconsider books that I had thought I might not want to read, they sometimes remind me, hey, you were interested in this, and then Shiny Objects came out, and you got distracted and went off in another direction, but this is still something that you really want to read. But let's start talking about the actual book. The Washington Post provided a blurb for every single one of the books in their top 10. So I will read that blurb to you, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the book after we do that. So here's what they say about Colored Television by Danzy Senna. Senna's shrewd comedy is about a biracial woman named Jane Gibson who is struggling to sell her ambitious second novel. So she holds her nose and turns to the glowing embrace of television, pitching a comedy about a kooky but lovable biracial family. Senna keeps her story from getting clotted with bits of didactic wisdom or social reproof. Even when Jane really wants to sell out and cash in, she never abandons her sense of irony or her determination to resist being the tragic star of somebody else's tale. It's an exceptionally assured novel about a culture constantly swirling between denigrating racial identity and fetishizing it. And this is, again, why I love these lists, because, as I said, it helps remind me in some cases of a book that I was interested in reading, and that this definitely puts this book back on my radar, and hopefully I'll catch up to it before the end of the year or maybe early next year, but it definitely was something that I was interested in. And I'm going to say something about it that I think is interesting, and the interest is sort of compounded by a connection between Danzy Senna and the author I'm about to make a connection to. So I want to do this carefully, because the description of Colored Television reminds me of Erasure by Percival Everett and the movie that was adapted out of that book, American Fiction, which was released last year. And the reason I want to be careful about that conversation is that I had forgotten that there's a connection between Danzy Senna and Percival Everett. And I was reminded of it during the National Book Award ceremony when Percival Everett won the National Book Award for Fiction for his book, James. My reaction to that will be down below. At the end of his acceptance speech, he thanked his wife, Danzy Senna. So it's interesting that the description of this book reminds me of Erasure and American Fiction. And if you're unfamiliar, I have not read Erasure, but in the movie American Fiction, you have a black author who is really struggling because he writes very serious literary novels and no one is taking him seriously. And the popular books all lean into these terrible stereotypes of black people and black culture and things like that. So in what he thinks is a joke, he writes an outlandishly stereotypical novel that leans into all the worst things that you would expect to see. And publishers go crazy for it. There's a bidding war. It comes out and it becomes a huge commercial and critical success. So it's a very different type of satire. And in fact, it feels like it sort of leans into the satirical direction in a way that colored television doesn't. And the reason I want to be careful about this conversation is that I don't want to at all imply that Danzy Senna is picking up on threads of a book her husband wrote. I don't think that at all. I think she's taking an interesting conversation that still needs to be had. And I think that's one of the things. Erasure is an older book. And when it was adapted as a movie last year, the conversation was still extremely relevant. And the release of color television, again, shows that there are more layers to add to that. So I feel like she's picking up on a conversation and taking it in a new and interesting direction and adding other layers on top of it. And I think it would be interesting to have seen the movie American Fiction and someday read the book Erasure that it was based on, and also read colored television, and hopefully end up with a more well-rounded picture of the situation, if that makes any sense at all. So hopefully this will be a book that I will be reading at some point. Now, it's fun to start with colored television and have that connection between Danzy Senna and Percival Everett, because it's sort of a natural bridge to the next book on the list, which is James by Percival Everett. I feel like it would be absolutely shocking not to see this book on a year-end best of list that involves fiction this year. So not at all surprised to see it here. This is probably the biggest critical success of this year. As I said, it won the National Book Award for Fiction. It was a finalist for the Booker Prize and ultimately lost, but it had felt like the front runner in some ways, and then ultimately didn't win the Booker, but it did get the National Book Award. I think it feels like the obvious choice for the Pulitzer Prize next year, but the Pulitzer Prize is so wildly unpredictable, especially since they don't release a long list or a short list before they announce the prize. They sometimes almost deliberately go in the opposite direction from what you expect. So it feels like the safe money is on James for the Pulitzer next year, but that also makes it feel like safe money is against James for the Pulitzer Prize next year, if that makes any sense at all. But yeah, the shocking thing would have been if this was not on this list. And I fully expect that we'll see it on the New York Times top 10 and in many other top 10s before we get to the end of the year. And again, if you're unfamiliar, this is a reimagining of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn told from the perspective of Jim, who comes to be known as James throughout the course of the book. And it's a subversion of Huckleberry Finn and the depiction of Jim, who again comes to be known as James, as an intelligent being navigating a world filled with racism that would like to murder him, essentially. Let's see what they say about it before I spend too much time talking about it. Everett's sly response to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn both honors and interrogates Mark Twain's classic, along with the nation that reveres it. Told from the perspective of the enslaved James, this is a book haunted by a little boy's innocence but no longer controlled by it. Instead of an ambling tale told drifting down a river, it's the story of a man racing against chaos to retrieve his family. James leans in hard on its thriller elements and gathers speed and terror like a swelling storm. Its conclusion is equally shocking and exhilarating. Now, when I did read James, that conclusion did put me off a bit, but in the time since I read it, it has sat with me and haunted me, and I've really come around on the book and come to appreciate it a great deal more. And I think one of my reactions to it is that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has like thrilling scenes in it and episodes in it, but it's not a thriller. So James sort of leaning into thriller elements of it and gathering speed feels like a departure. And then the ending of the book is a bit of a departure from a bit. It's a departure from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. No spoilers, but it is. And that felt difficult at the time, but now reflecting on the ways in which it stays with Mark Twain and departs from Mark Twain are actually fascinating and really fun to talk about. So I have overcome some initial resistance to James to become like a full-throated fan. Ignore my calendar. and fully endorse this book. Happy to see it here. I think we're going to see a lot more of James in these end of year conversations, and possibly when it comes to the Pulitzer Prize next year. The next book is My Friends by Hisham Matar. We are going to be... It's interesting that there are some correlations between both the Booker Prize and the National Book Award. We already saw some of those with James, which was on both lists. And now we see again with My Friends by Hisham Matar. On April 17, 1984, an angry demonstration swelled outside the Libyan embassy in London. Outraged by Muammar Gaddafi's murderous reign back home, dozens of Libyan students chanted slogans against the dictator. Suddenly, from the embassy's windows, shots were fired into the crowd. A British police officer was killed, and 10 demonstrators were wounded. In My Friends, a Libyan man named Khalid, who was present at that fateful moment, describes how he came to spend his adult life in England, pining for home. Part historical fiction, part cultural reflection, this is a story about the way exile calcifies the heart into an organ of brittle longing. I think this is a book that a lot of people had hopes for with the Booker Prize and with the National Book Award, and it felt like it just got drowned out of both. So I'm not surprised to see it on the list. It has a lot of fans. It does sound like something I would like to read. So this is something that has been on my list. It's not a situation like Colored Television where initial publicity sort of trailed off and I forgot about the book. I have not forgotten about My Friends, in part because it was on the shortlist for the National Book Award, which just announced the winner this week. But I feel like I do keep kind of putting it off. And I think a lot of that is because of election stress in the United States. And that's not going to go away, even though the election is over. But it is something I would really like to catch up to. And some of the conversations about this book have been really fascinating. So I'm not surprised to see it here. And I fully expect that we'll be seeing more of this one as well when we see other best of lists. Maybe not as much as we will be seeing of James, but I think we'll be seeing more of My Friends. Now we get to Playground by Richard Powers. It feels like if Richard Powers releases a book in any given year, hold a spot for him on the Booker Prize long list because he'll probably make it on, and hold a spot for him on several year-end best lists because he's just going to be there. Since he released The Overstory and won a Pulitzer Prize for that, he has just been that much of a mainstay in these big best books conversations. And I only got through the first portion of The Overstory before I put it down. Because it is a Pulitzer Prize winner, I will try to revisit it at some point. But I will probably do so on audio to see if that helps me get over the hump. Because I didn't get through The Overstory, I haven't read any of his other books, and I feel a bit of a resistance on my part, especially since I feel like I want to revisit The Overstory before I make any decisions about diving into other books. And even people who are fans of Richard Powers sometimes talk about his books in ways that make me a little resistant, because they'll be like, well, this subplot doesn't really add anything to the book, or it's really long and it doesn't have to be, or things like that, where I get a bit of resistance. And by the way, I should also mention that James, Percival Everett released The Trees, which was another book of his that sort of launched him into a similar level of conversation as Richard Powers. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues for both of these people. But anyway, here's what they say about Playground. Powers delivers a mind-blowing reflection on what it means to live on a dying planet reconceived by artificial intelligence. Although Playground is not as mammoth as his Pulitzer-winning opus, The Overstory, it follows a similarly fragmented structure. But any confusion on the reader's part eventually melts into wonderment. The story, far too complex to summarize here, involves a world-famous tech genius, an estranged friendship, a pioneering oceanographer, and the thinly populated island of Makatea, an atoll in French Polynesia. The Washington Post's critic Ron Charles wrote, "I can't think of another novel that treats the Earth's plight with such an expansive and disorienting vision." I feel like this is one that I'm going to let other people enjoy. I would prioritize My Friends. I would prioritize Colored Television. And maybe someday after I do The Overstory, I will decide to explore more of Richard Powers' work. But for me, this is one I'm pretty comfortable leaving alone for now. Which takes us to This Strange Eventful History by Claire Messud. which was on the long list for the National Book Award, not the National Book Award, the Booker Prize was on the long list for the Booker Prize. And that kind of briefly got me interested in it. I have been on a roller coaster with Claire Messud. The first book of hers that I read was The Emperor's Children, and I pretty aggressively hated that book and ignored her for a while. And then when she released a book called The Woman Upstairs, something convinced me to read it. And I actually found it really interesting. I think it's a flawed book, but I found it very interesting. So I have one book of hers that I sort of aggressively hate, one book that I find pretty fascinating. And then this book came out, and the way people talked about it as they were reading through the long list almost immediately made me think, I feel like I'm just going to leave this one alone. So I'm sort of in a Richard Powers situation here, where I feel like I'm going to let the people who enjoy it have fun, let the people who are interested in it have fun. But for me, because there are so many books that you could possibly read, I would prioritize my friends. I would prioritize colored television. And I have so many other books that aren't even on this list that I would like to prioritize before I would even think about doing this strange, eventful history. But it does sound like a fascinating book. So let's see what they say about it. Messud's latest novel was inspired by a 1,500-page memoir written by her paternal grandfather, who was born in what was once French Algeria. After a lifetime of reflection, Messud has imagined how 3 generations of a fictionalized family, the Cassers, rode the geopolitical waves from World War II into the 21st century. Regardless of how much it may draw from biographical details, the story grips our interest because of how expertly Messud shapes those incidents for dramatic effect. This is a novel of cavernous depth and relentless exploration, making us realize how much we know and how little we confess about our own families. And one of the reflections that I saw pop up again and again and again as people sort of read their way through the long list for the Booker Prize was that your reaction to this book really depends on whether or not you find her deep dive into her own family interesting. Like, there were some people, I think it was Roro Reeds in part, who would say things like, I feel like this is something that was very interesting for Claire Messud to write, I sort of question whether or not someone's deeply personal family story relates to broader audiences. So maybe it does. Clearly it does for some people because it made it onto the long list for the Booker Prize. It made it onto this list. But it feels like a bit of a cilantro book. You're either going to like it or you're not. And there aren't really any two ways about it. That takes us into the nonfiction portion of the list, where I can guarantee you I haven't read anything. And there is one huge surprising omission from this that we'll get to at the end of the video. But the first book on nonfiction is The Hidden Globe: How Wealth Hacks the World by Etosa Araxia Abrahamian. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It says, Abrahamian explores special economic zones, the fractured atlas of places that help the international rich bend globalization to their advantage, often by making it possible to do business within a country without being subjected to its laws. In the hands of a lesser writer, such material could be tedious, but Abrahamian populates her book with sharply drawn characters, engaging debates, and briskly told history. We have created a form of globalization, she argues, that allows money to hop the globe seamlessly while keeping people stuck in place. Interestingly, one thing that's jumping out to me is, depending when this book was published, it feels like it could be a contender for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction next year if it meets the eligibility window. And I think it would be really interesting to see it as part of that conversation. It sounds really interesting, but I am mostly a fiction reader, so I don't know that I would get around to it, but it sounds really interesting. Next is I Heard Her Call My Name, a memoir of transition by Lucy Sante. Since childhood, the writer Lucy Sante, formerly Luc Sante, knew she was transgender. This memoir is a 2-tier narrative, bouncing between her experience of her transition in 2021 and the details of her entire life. An acclaimed writer of essays on art and culture, as well as the cult classic Low Life, Lures and Snares of Old New York, Sante here writes about the sometimes paralyzing cost of trying to live 2 different lives, as a man or a woman, but also as a human being and a writer. This memoir, which also includes substantial sections about Sante's upbringing and creative life, is a funny and warm joy to read. Now, this is another just reiterating or sort of proving the point of why I love looking at these lists, because this is a book I had never heard of. And this list put it in front of me and said, pay attention to this and read this description. And reading the description of it right now is the first experience that I had of any description of this book. I saw the title when I was quickly running through the list to see if there were any copies of books that I owned that I would want to pull out. And I saw a memoir of transition, and I thought to myself, I bet you that's a transgender memoir. And it is. But this is a book I'd never heard of, and it put it in front of me. And it's a nonfiction book. And because I tend to read fiction, I tend to sort of ignore nonfiction. So I love these lists because they sort of challenge me to pay attention to other areas. So this is something I feel like I absolutely want to read. So I will probably look for an audio version of it and think about whether or not I'm going to do it before the end of the year, or if I'm going to let it slide into 2025. That seems more likely because there's not a whole lot of time left in 2024, but we'll see. But that is definitely something that I would really like to read. Next is Question 7 by Richard Flanagan. Flanagan, a Booker Prize-winning novelist for The Narrow Road to the Deep North, I believe that's the title of it, has produced a kind of philosophical fantasia, a highly original weaving together of a half-dozen essayistic narratives about the sad, wondrous world we live in. From memories of the author's childhood in a poor and extended Catholic family in Tasmania to an account of how Lou Szilard, the father of the atomic bomb, discovered the kernel for his speculations about nuclear chain reactions in H.G. Wells's novel The World Set Free. Flanagan keeps readers enchanted while boldly wrestling with the social, political, and moral complexities of modern history. I feel like that sounds really interesting, but because I'm not much of a nonfiction reader, it feels a little like I think I would probably read The Hidden Globe before I would read Question 7. I took a class on philosophy in college, and maybe it was the professor, but I came away almost feeling futile in the face of philosophical questions. Like, they can be fun, but it feels like you're just never going to get an answer and everybody's going to have their own opinion. So I tend to avoid them. That's just me. I'm sure a lot of people will really be into the idea of Question 7, and there's no judgment for that. But I feel like I would pretty comfortably skip that book. Now we have V13, Chronicle of a Trial by Emmanuel Carrère, translated by John Lambert. Coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015 killed 130 people. Starting in September 2021, a trial weighed the guilt of 20 men accused of participating in those attacks. The inimitable French journalist, memoirist, and novelist Emmanuel Carrère attended the proceedings nearly every day of their 10-month duration to write weekly dispatches for a magazine. This book-length account reveals the full convolutions of suffering Carrère was left, he writes, with a unique experience of horror, pity, proximity, and presence. So, too, is everyone fortunate enough to read his extraordinary and generous book. That actually sounds really interesting. I don't know that I feel like I Heard Her Call My Name is far and away my number one, and The Hidden Globe does sound really interesting, but I think this one might be my second place. Like, if you told me you have to read these books, the one I would probably get to next would probably be V13. I had never heard anything of it until just this moment. So if you've read it, let me know in the comment section down below. It does sound interesting, and like it's having a lot of difficult conversations. I have an aversion to true crime that sensationalizes crime and the people who commit crimes. But I am weirdly drawn to true crime books that talk about the larger social implications and impacts and effects of crime, not just on the victims and the victim's family, but on society at large. And this sort of sounds like it leans in that direction. I don't know if it's more academic or if it's more accessible, but it sounds like it could be really interesting. The final book on the list, I believe, yes, the final book on the list is When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s by John Gans. Gans revisits the era of Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot to find the roots of our current moment. He argues that the 1992 presidential election cycle was a circus and a warning that the establishment ignored at its peril. Perhaps most recognizable, enduring, and damning was a new political style, a brazen commitment to courting scandal and spectacle. Many of Gans's flashy subjects thrived in the spotlight. They were performers first and politicians second. This is a work of narrative history built with sharp character studies and deft exercises in political critique. That sounds really interesting. My only hesitation, the thing that sort of makes me stand back and go, is that I feel like you can make arguments going pretty far back that the roots of what we are experiencing politically now comes from this. And the truth is that the like a tree, the roots pretty much go everywhere. They go in a lot of different directions and touch a lot of different things. So sure, the 1992 presidential election probably does have a lot of places, but I feel like you can't really talk about Pat Buchanan without also talking about Reagan, which goes further back. Can't really talk about Reagan without talking about the sort of brazen way he pushed into a run for president and his run against Jimmy Carter. He had started to think about making a case against Gerald Ford when Gerald Ford ran against Jimmy Carter. And, you could go back to Nixon. And even in talking about Nixon's elections against Humphrey and any of them, you could then also talk about JFK and his election against Nixon and how it was the first televised election. And, television clearly had a huge... I immediately feel suspicious of anything that says this is where the story started, because I feel like often that's not the case. There are myriad ways in which the seeds of things that we are seeing today could come from things that came a lot further. I think a lot of conservative reactionary politics that we are still dealing with today in much more weaponized versions are still reactions to the politics of FDR and the ways in which we got out of the Great Depression and the New Deal and all of those things. So it sounds like a fascinating book. I've just complained about it a lot. I would potentially read it, but I resist easy answers, and I resist a sense of being able to say, this is where the problem started, this is where the problem comes from, because the problem comes from a lot of different areas. And talking about the 1992 presidential election cycle, and how it created where we are now, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if it addresses this, but you also can't have a conversation about where we are now without talking about systemic systems of injustice and racism in the United States that have existed since it was founded. So again, I have a sort of knee-jerk response where I am suspicious of this book's central premise, but I think it sounds fascinating. I think you probably can find a lot of insight into how things are today if you look at the 1992 presidential election. Is it the answer? John Gans would have to convince me, and that would be a very tough sell. But it sounds fascinating. So that is the top 10 that they gave us. Let me pull up my list. I did write down a couple of things I'm a little bit surprised not to see on the list. Headshot by Rita Bullwinkle, especially considering the sort of parallels between the Booker long list and the National Book Award long list. Headshot was on the National Book Award. I keep getting them confused. Headshot was on the Booker Prize long list, but didn't make it onto the short list. And I read it and I thought it was fine. I fully expect that we will see Headshot on the New York Times top 10 because they feel like full-throated enthusiasts for that book. So maybe not so surprising that it's not on the Washington Post's top 10, but I fully expect that it will be on the New York Times top 10. Orbital by Samantha Harvey, the book that beat James for the Booker Prize, not here. Neither is Stone Yard Devotional by Charlotte Wood, which felt like another contender for the Booker Prize. Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner, which was on both the Booker long list and the National Book Award long list, ultimately did not break through here. It will be interesting to see if it makes appearances on other year-end best lists. Martyr by Kaveh Akbar felt like it had a really good shot at showing up here. I think if we look at the 50 notable, which I will at some point after filming this, I feel like it has a good shot at being there. It'll be interesting to see where else that book goes. And then in terms of nonfiction, I'm very surprised that Knife by Salman Rushdie was not included on the nonfiction list. That feels like a huge glaring omission. That is one of the biggest critical smashes in nonfiction this year. So I'm both surprised that it did not win the National Book Award for nonfiction, and I'm surprised that it did not show up here on this list of best books. And it'll be interesting to see if it gets left off of both this and the New York Times top 10. I'm going to be floored. I will be just floored. So let me know what you thought of this list, what you are happy to see included, which books you are really excited to read, which books you have read and love, and what you're disappointed didn't make it. Let me know all of that in the comment section down below. I will be back to talk about their 50 notable books, and as soon as the New York Times releases its 100 notable books, I'll be all over that, and as soon as they announce their top 10, I will be all over that as well. Anyway, until then, I really appreciate your time, as always, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.